Okay, welcome. So this is our next recorded lecture that, as promised, will be about City Beautiful and goes under the title City of Monuments. Um, so what I'm going to do in this lecture is that I'm talking about the concept of City Beautiful, starting with two precedents or two examples of Rome and Paris that have been inspirational for other cities around the world to try to emulate a similar idea of beauty, organization, grandiosity as these cities have. But then Rome and Paris are not the only cities that have been inspirational for the City Beautiful movement. Also, Vienna, for example, um, has been another inspiration that we have not taken over in this lecture, just because it would be getting too big. So this world map with these arrows shows a couple of cities we are dealing with in this lecture, and the arrows show how this idea is originating in Europe and travels around the world. So from Europe it travels over to the US, then travels back to mainly British colonies in Africa and in India, and then from there it also continues to Australia, and in the end we see that the ideas, after traveling all over the world, come back to Europe and yeah, have been an inspiration for some authoritarian leaders, yes, in Europe. So let's jump right in there. Our first example is Rome, and it's the Rome of Pope Sixtus. And Sixtus was the Pope that got into power after the decline of Rome. Um, Even if you don't know the exact history of Rome, you probably know that Rome for a long time was the dominating empire in the Western world, and at some point this empire declined. So Pope Sixtus was the Pope that was in charge after the decline of Rome. So somehow he was confronted with a lot of decay, ruins, and yeah, was in search of a way to bring back the glory to the city, but also to manifest the Catholic Church um, more deeply ingrained into the city fabric. So, what is interesting is that he reorganized the city and he created a new type of public network connecting different points of religious importance, um, cultural importance, into a network that was especially important from a Catholic religious view. So if you would go to Rome back in the days, it was not possible to see all the important religious sites in one day, simply because the organization of the city was so fragmented and bad. Um, so what this new network of Pope Sixtus did was to connect all these different points um, into a much more efficient um, structure, and at the same time it would give those Catholic buildings and the squares that were um, erected a much more bigger importance in the urban fabric and the public life. I'll go more into detail on that later. So here you see kind of a diagrammatic sketch and one of those squares. I will also talk about that more later. So from here, so we're talking about a late 16th century. In your architecture history, you probably remember that this is time of Baroque, and we'll see a lot of Baroque architecture. So at the time, this was what is left of Rome. In this figure ground map, you see black areas. It's the old Rome, and there you see the new public network superimposed by Sixtus on the city, which is like half in the still remaining existing urban fabric and half out of it. And on this urban fabric you see different important points for religious belief. So different churches mainly, and different squares. As you know, also the Vatican is over here, the center of the Catholic Church. So that is of course also connected, and then you have different churches that are treated as important urban moments, which are given like special importance in the urban design through special design of like those axes between them and the squares in front. So first thing you realize are that these axes are perfectly straight, as if somebody drew them with a ruler. This has something to do with lines of sight to create a better orientability. So that means when you're traveling Rome or you're on a religious pilgrimage, you can easily orientate and you easily know where to go from one point to the next, simply because you can always see the next important point from this axis that you're on. So there were several reasons for the downturn of Rome. So not only has the Roman Empire and the Roman army been overcome, but also the infrastructure of the city has been destroyed, and notably this has been the destruction of the aqueducts, those waterways that would transport fresh water over kilometers. Right? So only with a good supply of fresh water you can maintain the city. And if this infrastructure is destroyed, of course, that the quality of life drops dramatically and people will leave the city. So this leads to decay, of course. And then the second reason is, what I just mentioned, that if these basic supplies of fresh water or other basic needs are not supplied, then people will leave the city and find their luck somewhere else. And then there's also been pressure on the Catholic Church from the Protestant movement. So more people were moving towards a different belief, which also gave less power to the Catholic Church that was located in Rome. This is an image of the aqueducts. Well, most of you probably know it. It's only to show you the ingenuity of the architecture and the infrastructure. How at that time already it was possible to transport fresh water over these long distances and make it possible for such a big city as Rome to exist. This shows the drastic population decrease in Rome. So if we're going from a city of more than 1 million inhabitants to a city of about 17,000. And this is a image Martin Luther hammering the thesis on the church in Wittenberg and proclaiming the Protestant movement, which I just mentioned as one of the 3 reasons for the downturn of the Roman Empire. So let's go back to the city and the urban structure. So what was left of Rome was this part. This was still populated, and then these were important sites, right? But they were not properly connected. And this pink um, lines is the new public network that has been superimposed on the city by 60s. And then, as we will see later, this public network um, remains intact until today, which is quite impressive. So over hundreds of years, these accesses have not been destroyed. It's almost as if you have a skeleton, right? And the body has a skeleton, and if that is really robust and strong and works well, then the city can grow around it, and even transformations like the invention of car and other modes of transport did not change the network in a way that it would be destroyed. It might transform at some point, but still visible in the urban structure today, which is quite remarkable. So, what did he do, and what are the qualities of this new public network? So, in order to give the Catholic Church an important space in the layout of Rome, he was coordinating the routing, so the accesses of the new public space, with the architecture to create imposing scenes. So that means this architecture and the public spaces around it was purposefully designed to impress. And we will also see the examples that I show you later that they were also purposefully designed to make you feel small. If you imagine that Catholic Church symbolizes the presence of God, and from that perspective, it makes sense to try to make the human feel small, lost, and vulnerable, and the presence of God is grandiose, big, and imposing. So, second quality is marking important public spaces with monuments. Um, so, yeah, there would be points of references that also help you to orientate, to find your way. So it's not only the accesses that you can see from one space to the other, but you can also see something at the end, which were these monuments. And then what was smart about Sixtus' strategy is that he did not rely purely on the religiousness of people to use these spaces and to cherish these spaces, but he also gave these religious spaces an important location in everyday life. So he would restore, at least in part, the water supply, and this meant that he would create public fountains. And these public fountains would be related to those public spaces and to these important spaces in front of those monuments or churches that were designed, to be imposing spaces. So even when you're an atheist, even when you don't believe in God, still you would have to come to these squares almost on a daily basis, and so this would become center of daily life, centers of religious life, and also center of social life. Then, we see different lines of development. Here you see examples of Piazza del Popolo and Santa Maria de Maggiore. That were connected with this public network. And here you see again, those axes and these dots are symbolizing those monuments, so those are becoming markers in the back that help you to orientate on your pilgrimage or simply help you orientate through the city. And here you see the diagram that I introduced earlier, only with this addition. So these symbolize obelisks. So as you probably know, these obelisks, they're not Roman. They are Egyptian. How can I say? They have been taken when the Roman Empire overcame the Egyptians. They have been taken as trophies back to Rome. But when the Roman Empire declined, they were simply lost and forgotten and not really used. So what Sixtus did is that he activated another layer in the urban history by reactivating these obelisks. So he got them out again and used these obelisks as those monuments at those focal points that I was just showing you in the slide before. So that were these points. So those are the points of reference, right, where your line of sight ends or is directed to. And you would give those special meaning by using those historic features. Yeah, this is just to show you an obelisk here in Egypt, just as a reminder. And this is a map showing the different locations of those new water fountains that Sixtus created. So you see that not all of them are located in those important public spaces, but almost all public spaces that he created have at least one fountain. And then, of course, you need more fountains for the supply, so they are spread around. And if you look at the next image, you see that those fountains were not just technical, providing enough water and being designed very efficiently, but they were also meant to enhance the grandiosity of the space, decorated expensively, and yeah, having water fountain here coming out of the lion's head, and just to show that efforts were being made to make this look grandiose. And those building in the back, yeah, they will also come back in the presentation as one of the urban design tools, but I will talk about that later. So first space I'm going to talk about is the St. Peter's Square, which is actually in the Vatican, on the west side of the city, on the other side of the river. And one of the things that catches your eye probably right away is this obelisk in the center. As I said, there's a central axis, right, for the view, locating this important building at the end of the axis and marking the square with that obelisk. And one other thing that I think is quite beautiful about this image is that you see how small these people are, right? So I talked before about the importance of making people feel small in the presence of God, which basically means you should disappear in the space or look or feel lost in the space in front of the grandiosity of that architecture that symbolizes God. So on the one hand, they realize that ambition because the space is really big, But on the other hand, they also start using tricks. So the Baroque time is famous for um, having figured out the rules of perspective, and by figuring those rules out, they also understood how to manipulate them. So over here is a picture taken standing right in the center of that axis, looking towards St. Peter's Square, and you see how imposing and big the building is. You see that the architecture is working together with a public space, creating a mirror axis. Um, Two sides of the building almost identical. The marker in front is, spatially detached, but visually absolutely part of the same scheme. This center of the obelisk is the center of the building, and center of the public space as well. Here you see how people vanish in that big space, and here you also see that the building is a little bit higher than the photographer, right? So this has the effect that it feels like the building is kind of hovering on top of you and making it appear even bigger than it is. For example, if you look at this section, there's one problem. It should be longer. So if you extend this section, you have to believe me that there's a longer road here, and that road is slightly inclining until it reaches this square in front of the building, and then it's inclining slowly. Then the square itself is flat, and then it inclines further. That you can see here, and then the building is hovering on top of you. And what is important about this slope is that it's not steep, it's quite shallow slope, which also has a effect on your perception, which makes the space look bigger and longer than it actually is. So here in this image you can see a little bit better how that approach is designed. Again, the symmetry with the central axis. You see here how that visual effect is created by slightly sloping up road. And then there's also a trick they play with your perception with these columns. It looks as if they are in a static distance, always same distance, but in fact they're shortening the distance the further you go away, which also plays with your perspective and makes that distance seem longer than it actually is. So building looks bigger than it actually is, and space looks deeper and bigger, longer than it actually is. These are tricks to deal with your perception and make the spaces even more imposing than they are. Oh yeah, and here you also see that this square in the front, the smaller one before you get to the ellipse-shaped square, is tapered. So that taper shape also has another effect on your perception and making spaces seem bigger than they actually are. Okay, if we go to the other side now, we start with Piazza del Popolo, and we kind of take a virtual tour on that public network and go from one space to the other. So here you see the space with this is kind of the anchor, the central point visually. These are the different axes, and this is the Spanish Steps. Actually, I will talk about this in a minute. I will go first to Piazza del Popolo, and here you can see yeah, how this space is composed. Again, in the center of the square, that is where you have the obelisk. So these three axes all cross each other in that point where you have the obelisk. So very clear marker, very visual connection. Then you have these two buildings, which is another like visual effect to make two identical buildings leading to that square, which emphasize the symmetry and also the staticness of that square. If you go to the next image, you see again those two buildings almost identical, being also special and higher than the other ones. Again, a square that is from a human scale perspective too big. People get lost here. And then the square is also very well defined, right? So the adjacent buildings, they create like one continuous facade. So this almost works like one wall, whereas it's composed out of different different buildings with different owners. But that was one of the rules that they created, right? So by having these all in one line, it defines the public space quite well. Even here where there's no building, it's just a garden over here or a park, there you would have a big blind wall still in the same line as the other buildings, so that really grounds the space very well and defines very well how the space looks. Yeah, for example, in Korea, I think it's if you look at the average street in those small-scale neighborhood, it's pretty much the opposite, right? You hardly have two buildings in the same line. You always have like buildings coming out, which gives like weird shape to the public space, and therefore it always looks kind of messy and undefined. Now, here they define it very strictly. And again, you can see that here, right? The buildings around, even where there are no buildings, and there's a clear definition with a wall. And then you get also different layers by creating these inner walls, define the space a little bit more. And that's what you see here. Yeah, in this image, big space, central marker, blind walls, very straightforward defined public space, and here you see another fountain as I introduced earlier. So this is one of the aspects that I pointed out in the beginning of the lecture. So in the 60s, no, even before, let's just say when the car took over as the predominant means of transport, yeah, people simply didn't know where to park in a city that was not planned for the car. So then these squares started to become bastardized and turned into big parking lots. Only later did the city government, people of Rome understand like the value of these, not only from a cultural perspective, but also from an economic perspective, because these public spaces have a big potential for driving tourism, right? A lot of people visit Rome just to see the beauty of it, and tourism in the end becomes a big economic factor. Another nice photograph of those two symmetrical buildings at Piazza del Popolo. And then, yeah, this image again, this is the spot where it does belong. So this is Piazza del Popolo, and then next location in that sequence of spaces would be the Spanish Steps. And the funny thing is, if you draw this axis, then the focal point is here, right? This is the dot that symbolizes the marker, the monument in front of that church. So strictly speaking, this axis should directly connect, right? That's the principle. But here actually the topography doesn't allow that, because there's a steep cliff over here. So what they did instead is they make one axis connect here in front of the lower side of the cliff, and then have another axis start on the upper side of the cliff, and have one transition connecting two of those axes. And that connection you see here. Though that's the Spanish Steps. And I thought it's kind of funny that what started out as a mistake, or yeah, basically kind of a mistake that doesn't go with your basic concept of making this corridors, these axes, in the end becomes one of the, or probably the most famous and most cherished part in a already famous public network. So these are the Spanish Steps, and again one of those fountains in front, very beautiful, grandiose. The elements are there. There's the marker over here, church up behind. This is the fountain and the big steps, helping you to go from the one axis to the other. If you haven't been to Rome, I've never been to Rome, but I've seen this image many times. Everybody knows the Spanish Steps from some movie or image. Everybody knows it. So this is an old image of the thing. See the grandiosity going up to the church. Symmetry in the design of the public space, well-defined edges of the public space, and central point, of course, those that fountain. This is the marker on the upper side. So if you compare this to the fountain, much less grandiose, but nevertheless the principle is there. Right? They didn't put obelisks everywhere. So this is another type of marker. And another image of the Spanish Steps. Yeah, becoming one of the most famous tourist attractions of Rome. Another one by night. Now, and here you see again how busy it is. Okay, and then we just continue our virtual tour and see here how you go from the Spanish Steps to Santa Maria Maggiore, where you have again the idea of the axis, another axis crossing, and then this next church again with an important public space in front. And you already know the elements, right? Symmetry, central axis, a marker, again an obelisk, huge public space, and symmetric building. So again, architecture, public space design work together. It's designed together. I wish that photographer would have stood a little bit further to the right so you can see the symmetry a little bit better. But nevertheless it works, right? You can see and understand the space and how the elements are coming back. And then continuing that virtual journey, again, of course, central axis, straight roads. And here you find on the way a small square. Actually, it's more like an intersection that they connected and connected to axes, and to give a little bit of importance to this intersection, they implemented these four fountains there. So each of these are fountains. They almost look like a piece of art, right? These big statues there, lots of efforts being taken to dress this up and make this special. And from there, these are another set of images where you can see those fountains, how much effort they would take, how they try to involve other arts, sculpture, into making these special places. And here again, like a couple of recent images where you see how it works today. So urban life, of course, changed, but the public network still exists, still the access markers and so on. Now it becomes a bit repetitive. Same thing, again, obelisk as marker, well-defined public space, symmetric buildings. Now, you know this by now. And this is what I find a nice kind of diagrammatic map of part of that public network. And yeah, that's it for Rome. So I promised 2 European examples, and from here I go to the second one, much more recent one, which is Paris, right? And I'm talking about the so-called renovation of Paris in the 19th century. So this was done by Haussmann, and was done on the command of Napoleon. Here the image, you see one of those beautiful boulevards that was created at the time. And this is another bird's eye perspective, where you see the boulevard as a central element in the public space, and you see elements coming back that we have just introduced for Rome, right? The straight axis, important building at the end, and we will see other elements coming back as well. So one step back, Rome has been in decay, but Paris had been booming. There was big population growth, rapid urbanization taking place. It grew in, let's say, 25 years with about 800,000 people. So immense growth, and that led to problems that I've pointed out in the first lecture of bad living conditions, bad health conditions, sanitary situation was bad, so that would lead to health concerns, epidemics breaking out, tuberculosis especially. I added this, you might have seen it, there used to be a musical that played here in Seoul, Les Miserables. The Miserable, so that is actually a story of people living in those slums in Paris at the time. Just as a reminder, then these conditions, I think we pointed them out extensively. Overcrowding, bad facilities, no running water, often no sewage, and then that together with like crime, and from an urban design perspective, also problem of narrow alleys, dark alleys with no clear orientation that just feel shady and dark and make you feel unsafe. So that was the situation, and then yeah, Napoleon gave Haussmann the order to restructure Paris, redesign it, and introduce wide boulevards and create space and light. Still at the time, part of the myth was that these epidemics were caused by bad air and the stink. Right? We also heard that in the first lecture. So one of the ideas was to break open the overcrowded city and bring in light and air. Yeah, this is another boulevard, also in Paris, and down here, this map, we'll see another version of that, just to introduce how rigorous and aggressive Haussmann has been redesigning Paris. So those red lines are the new boulevards that he was cutting into the existing urban fabric, and you see that this has been designed on a table far away from the actual place where he was intervening, simply taking a ruler, right, and destroying whatever is in the way. Very rigorous and aggressive. Yeah, that's what you see here. Of course, if you have a design idea of creating these moments of grandiosity, if you want, there's axes, there's lines of sight, you have to be aggressive in that way, because the existing urban fabric hardly has these kind of elements. Yeah, here you see how often they don't have anything to do with the existing urban fabric, or at least they look random. And here you also see, like, this is the square where you have Arc de Triomphe in the center. It's probably one of those monuments that also everybody knows from Paris. That has been given more importance by attaching even more roads to that square than it had before. So that's what Haussmann did. Very rigorous, aggressive intervention into the urban fabric. He introduced a new urban design element when he cut open those axes, which was then the boulevard, right? So they became the new backbone of the urban network, public network in Paris, and they also introduced a new type of public space, if you want, and also public life. So once these boulevards were made, these also turned into public spaces, social spaces, where people would come and meet each other or just walk. You probably heard about the term of the flaneur. So actually this came after this new road typology of the boulevard has been introduced, where the flaneur is a person who simply walks around kind of aimlessly through the city, or simply to look around and to be seen. Also has something to do with like leisure. All of a sudden, you know, this is starting to be a modern city. People have leisure time that didn't exist before. So before people were only working, so now more people would have leisure time, and some of them would use the time to stroll around the flaneur. Here you see, bottom left, quite clear those elements coming back that we've seen in Rome as well. Central axis, big important monument, right? It's not an obelisk, but still it's also symmetrical. It's in line with the public space and the axis. And then something else that I've found interesting in Haussmann's urban design is that he used these trees very strategically. So first of all, they don't look like trees, right? Or they're just green, but then they're cut like pieces of architecture, and they're cut like into boxes, kind of squarish, rectangular things. And what he achieves through that is that he emphasizes that perspective, um, similar to also what has been done in Rome, right? Looking at the St. Peter Square. It gives you some kind of visual continuity. Sorry, that accompanies you throughout the whole city. So if you imagine, like over here on the top right, you have an image with that kind of chaotic, overcrowded, small-scale neighborhood, very organic, and yeah, often not in good shape. And that is contrasted with that urban boulevard, with that straight-edged, well-defined public space. You can imagine sometimes these facades, these buildings don't look good, right? Sometimes they're just poor areas and it doesn't look good. And this is, again, of course, very visual-oriented design strategy. So if you use these trees as a design element, it helps you to direct the view, and it helps you to kind of hide those less well designed or simply poorer areas. Okay. Right, and then this is the new network of Paris after Haussmann's intervention, and you see all these squares. I kind of like this map because it highlights the public spaces and the importance of the public spaces, and that's where the detail is. And yeah, this new network of connections and monumental buildings of Haussmann, they had three aims. So the first one was to enhance the monument's position in the city, like I pointed out with the Arc de Triomphe, right? So he would isolate them and make visual connections between them. Then the second one is do away with unhealthy and degrading living conditions, establish modern living everywhere. So that's the idea of bringing in light and air into the city, and while bringing in those boulevards, also enhancing the underground infrastructure. Then third one is provide space and light as well as easy orientation and connections. So space and light already mentioned, and the orientation of course also enhances when you connect important points in the city fabric, straight lines. Yeah, that helps the orientation, of course, very similar to what has been done in Rome. But then there are also critics of Haussmann's intervention that point out that Haussmann has been working on the behalf of Napoleon, authoritarian king, who was in fear that he would not be able to control the people. So what do you do if there's an uprising, right? Or what do you do yeah, to control those people? So the criticism is that those boulevards maybe did not have predominantly an aim to improve the public space, but were a tool that made it possible to control different sectors of the city easily, meaning it's easy to control the big boulevard with the soldiers or policemen, rather than a city that is all like chaotic and organic. And it's also easy to move soldiers around the city. If there's an uprising over here, it's fast to move your troops over there. So yeah, that's what critics of Haussmann say, that this has been um, maybe predominantly uh, a way to serve the power of Napoleon rather than kind of noble goal of providing better spaces for the people. In the end, it's probably a mix of both. And then I go to the next slide, and the next couple of slides show you in more detail how those cuts have been employed and how rigorous they were. So here you see existing urban fabric and how these new boulevards simply cut through very aggressively, even like cutting houses in half, yeah, being very straightforward and aggressive, and then leading to this new kind of public space network, um, where all these monuments are well connected. Naja, and you see that this idea was clearly the driving force in the design, connecting the monuments, making an imposing public network, and the living spaces, dwellings, commercial spaces, that's secondary, right? That's just whatever happens, happens, as long as the public network is well designed. This is an image of Arc de Triomphe, again, that I mentioned before, right? All these old and new streets leading to that port. Couple of images before and after, how the streets widened, using those visual connectors, monuments at the end of the line of sight. Right, widening. Also, that points just, taking away the old bad city structure. And here again, superimposing like those different layers from different times, different streets. How they create this kind of crazy, not crazy, but totally random pattern. So often in other cities you see like an organization of the buildings, and then that translates into the organization of the streets, but here it's the other way around, right? The streets are organized first, and then you get weird shapes for the lots that have to be filled in. Another example of the same thing, the white lots all have strange and different shapes. So architects are the ones that have to find solutions for that. Interesting, but also challenging, right? No corners same, it's difficult to repeat stuff, difficult, as you can see here, to deal with it. So this used to be one urban block, but then these two roads are cutting through. So all of a sudden you get different typology for the houses, and still overcrowded city, right? So they try to use the space they have as efficiently as possible. Then you see here in this mass little holes. So those are the light wells and air wells to get light and air into the buildings. The bigger ones are again calculated on the diameter of that fire hose, and at times that there might be a fire, you have to be able to rotate around. So these are minimum dimensions, and then you can also make those light and air wells more efficient if two adjacent houses share one. Now, we've seen this also in other cities earlier, so this has been done in Berlin. Sorry, Paris. I think we also know the same thing from Berlin. Here you see the weird shape of the lots. It was kind of like this, right? Pretty rectangular and somewhat organic, but still organized. Now you get weird angles because you have this new road coming through in a strange angle. And this is yeah, how the lots work then. It's complicated to build, as I said, hardly any repetition that you can do, but on the other hand also has positive aspect, which is that you get different sizes of houses within one block. So thinking of like different user groups, different people of different income living together, this gives an incentive for that, right? If you have such a big diversity of bigger and smaller spaces, you can rent them or buy them for more or less money. So this creates somewhat like the ground for a more diverse composition of the residents. More of the same. How the lots are divided, again, big and small lots, also in the more rectangular organization. Yeah, here more evidence of the same, right? I said it already. Here you just see the length, and here you see the weird floor plans that architects would have to deal with. Right, and then we go to the outside. Already, what we also heard from the case of Rome is that you would have continuous facades, right? You have the same height for all buildings, and you have a continuous facade. Buildings don't go in and out and have weird angles. So this creates very much yeah, the definition of those streets. Something I also mentioned in the case of Berlin, similar in Paris, where you would have shops on ground floor. Then this would be normally servants or like shop owners living here, and these two floors would be like the bel etage, where often the building owner or the more wealthy people would live, and then the more you go up, cheaper it gets again. So in that sense also diverse way of living, some more floor plans or rudimentary floor plans. And they had very stringent regulations for the front side of the facade, so they even regulated where balconies had to be, where the balconies could be, which also then you have to imagine all these houses have different owners, they probably have different tastes, but by regulation there needs to be a balcony on the side, and they need to be continuous, which also creates this idea of unity, similar to what has happened in the with the trees on the boulevards. And here some backside facades, of course those are less dressed up. So as a last slide, let me check. Yeah, this is the last slide for Paris. Just to make it even more clear, I I found this set of diagrams that relate Paris to New York and show like how different the urban structures of those two like amazing cities are. On the one hand, Paris has a very high level of diversity. All lots are different, like I showed, like the islands are different. There's a bigger array in the like hierarchy of the network. You have the boulevards, the very big streets, and then the main streets, secondary, tertiary streets, and alleys. Big diversity of streets, whereas in Manhattan you only have the streets and the avenues, right? You have two types of streets, and even those are quite similar, and they decide, yeah, how the blocks look, and the blocks are also all similar, totally different, Paris and New York. Here, there's hardly any repetition, right? And here, there's hardly anything that is not repeating. There's only this one street here, which is the Broadway. So that is based upon a old pathway from back in the times from when the Indians were still living in Manhattan. So that's a rudiment of that old like use of the space, onto which they then superimpose the grid of Manhattan. So this is the only exception, whereas Paris kind of only has exceptions, if you want. That's what you see here. Okay, so this is first part of the lecture, kind of the base, and from here in the second lecture I will talk about all those different other cities, like I said, the US, Africa, India, Australia, and back to Europe, that have grown from this idea, and the whole City Beautiful movement that has taken these inspirations up and like spread it over the world as an urban design principle. Okay, thank you.